Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on agency-level measurement. I'm going to turn it over to Mulu Chekel from Save the Children, who's one of the co-chairs of our Evaluation and Program Effectiveness Working Group in just a second to introduce our speakers. But before I do, I just wanted to go through a few logistics. First, everyone will be on mute throughout the presentation. We'll save the Q&A until the end, but we'll do that in two ways. You can send questions to me through the question box, so you could just type it into the question box and send that to me anytime during the presentation. Or when we jump into the Q&A, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question directly. So with that, Mulu, I'll just turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Laia. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to our webinar session, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Mulu Chekel. I'm the Senior Director for Monitoring and Evaluation and Knowledge Management at Save the Children. I'm also the co-chair of the Interaction, Evaluation and Program Effectiveness Working Group, along with Hemberger from CRS and Laia Grigno, who manage the working group at Interaction. One of our focus areas for the working group this year has been facilitating information and knowledge sharing among working group members and other interest groups, and today's sessions is aimed at that. As Laia pointed out, our session today is entitled Agency Level Measurement, Continuing the Conversation. The reason why we called it Continuing the Conversation is that at the 2012 Interaction Forum, a number of NGOs, including Save the Children, CRS, Mercy Corps, and AfriCare, held a workshop in which we've shared our experiences and challenges in instituting agency-level results measurement. And as a follow-up to that conversation, we started at that time. Today's presenters, Sophie Walker and Alison Hemberger of Mission Measurement, will share findings from their research and client experiences about the successful implementation of agency-wide measurement and approaches such as core indicators and other practical solutions that have worked for NGOs. I'm sure Sophie and Alison will say a bit about mission measurement when they start their presentation, but I would like to say a few words about our speakers. Sophie is a senior associate as Mission Measurement, and she brings data and research expertise to help their clients understand how their work can drive greater social impact. She's particularly engaged in the role of measurement and evaluation in international development, and since joining Mission Measurement, her clients included USAID, Cisco, NetHope, MIT, and TechnoServe. Prior to joining Mission Measurement, Sophie worked in various organizations, including Nuclear Policy Think Tank in Washington, D.C., at the Hanover Research Group. And also, Sophie is a pro bono consultant with Compass DC and an active volunteer for Habitat for Humanity. Alison Hemberger, who is an engagement manager at Mission Measurement, she works with clients across sectors who are focused on creating new solutions to social needs, helping them to demonstrate outcomes and impact. Prior to joining Mission Measurement, Alison worked also with various organizations, including with CARE, Innovation for Impact, for Poverty Action, and the International Lifeline Fund. Sophie and Alison have worked with a range of NGOs and funders to help build M&E capacity, as well as use measurement to drive organizational strategy, investment decisions, and program designs. So thank you, Sophie and Alison, for taking the time to share your findings and engage in a discussion with us today. I'll now pass it over to you to start your presentation, Sophie and Alison. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mulu and Laia, for the kind introduction. We're very excited to be here today and have such great attendance from really a diverse group of organizations. And we think that that really speaks to the fact that this is an issue that's coming up across the board as being very important to agencies who are working often with disparate sectors or different types of programs and trying to present those at an agency level. So this came up a topic for us as we were starting to work with organizations over the past couple of years, was a topic around how can agency level measurement be done effectively. And what we're talking about here is really outcomes agency level measurement and performance measurement at the agency level. So we just wanted to put that definition out there before we get into some of the details today. So to start off with, I just wanted to give an overview of how we're going to structure the next hour, and then we'll get into some of the meat of the discussion. So first we'll give a very brief overview of who we are, which Mulu has already done a little bit. Then we'll talk about what are some of the trends in the field that we're seeing as we work exclusively in the measurement space, trends that are driving this need for agency level measurement. Next, we'll talk about some of the barriers we've seen as we've been working with organizations and doing research on this topic around why this is a struggle to do and why it's presenting a challenge. Then we'll talk about what the power of strategic agency level measurement is and what it can offer to an organization that's doing it effectively. And finally, where we really want to focus a lot of energy are what are actual best practices in implementing agency level measurement and doing it in a way that can help you. And we know that a lot of you are M&E focused, but we also have a lot of program staff on the call as well. So we think that that's an exciting opportunity to really bridge the gap between program and M&E, which is something we see as missing in a lot of the organizations we work with. And then finally, as Laia said, we'll leave room, quite a bit of room at the end for Q&A, and look forward to hearing your questions. So to start off, Mission Measurement, our firm, is a strategy consulting firm, and we help clients create value through social change. And Alison and myself primarily work in the M&E space in international development, working across all types of organizations, including implementing organizations, multilaterals, funders, some of which Mulu mentioned in our introduction. But I think what's exciting about our firm and the way that we think about measurement is that our work really is cross-sectoral, and we work across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to help organizations think through how measurement can be used to actually drive their strategy. So to highlight this, we just wanted to give an overview of what our approach is as an organization. We always start by trying to define success, asking the question of what are we really trying to accomplish. And this includes working with all of the key stakeholders in an organization to really identify those priority outcomes and define performance metrics that will be valuable and impactful for the organization, as well as feasible. Then we go into actually discussing how to measure the results in a practical way. This includes helping organizations design measurement processes and actually implement the data collection, whether in the field or at the kind of agency level. And then finally, where we really differentiate ourselves as a firm is that we're really thinking through how do you actually take that data and the results and the analysis and actually drive strategy. How do you use data to inform the decisions you're making? And so the final part of this loop is how to inform strategic decisions and really align strategies around data. And we'll talk a lot today about strategic alignment, which is something that we've been really interested in as an organization, and we think this conversation around agency level measurement really ties into. So I'll pass it off to Alison, who's going to start by talking about some of the trends in this space.
Thanks, Sophie. And what we want to do in this section is just highlight what we've been hearing and probably what you all have also been hearing and seeing in the field, and use that as a platform for talking about why strategic measurement at the agency level is something that's so critical and so well timed right now. So first of all, we can take a look at this from the donor perspective. When we look across donor agencies, I'm sure that everyone has noticed that there are a lot of shifting sands. There's a renewed emphasis on looking at impact evaluations, pushing out of accountability exercises, and trying to measure outcomes rather than outputs that will measure the progress towards the impact that agencies are trying to achieve. And I think what we want to highlight here is the fact that because we're not focused on doing accountability exercises anymore, measurement is really becoming a learning tool from the perspective of donors. And so here, we want to highlight that donors are focused on thinking about how they can be iterative in the types of results that they see and how they can think more strategically about what they fund. And what we want to highlight is that from an agency-level perspective, this type of experimentation opens a lot of doors and allows implementing organizations the opportunity to really measure in a strategic way and help use that to inform both their funding but also the general environment in which they're able to operate. So then when we take a look at the current environment from the perspective of implementers, we see that there are a lot of challenges that organizations are currently facing, but that there are also a lot of problem-solving approaches that your organizations are undertaking as well. Of course, under reduced budgets and difficult economic times, there are reduced available resources to turn into grants and to turn into implementing activities. In addition, there has been a new emphasis on having data to inform the types of funding that reoccurs and to inform the types of stakeholders that are engaged in your work. And this creates, a real impetus for implementing organizations to think smarter about the type of reporting that they do. Also, there's a renewed trend towards centralization within the industry and particularly within implementing organizations. Everyone is learning that coordination and thinking about expectations and thinking about the outcomes that our organizations are achieving, both within our organizations more critically, but also across our organizations, is something that can really feed into better implementation. Building on top of that, building on top of these reduced resources and building on top of this need for better communication and clearer learning, we have a lack of M&E capacity and a lack of budgets to carry out M&E. And so there's a real push among implementing organizations to increase the investment in M&E so that programs can improve. And in addition, we want to be able to do a better job in general of aggregating data so we can look at what we're learning on an individual level, at a program level, and think about how that plays into our missions and strategy at an organizational level. So really what this means is that we have a lot of trends that are driving towards an increased coordination and centralization, a search for consistency, and for common knowledge sharing across organizations, no matter what type of player they are in this space. From the implementer's perspective, we have global confederations, a lot of the large international NGOs coming together, thinking about international umbrellas that they can use as an administrative function, but also as a capability that allows them to better learn and execute their projects. There's also an emphasis on making sure that we push to the field level in understanding what it is that's working and not working and how we can improve with our technical assistance programs. And again, as much as we push for field-based technical assistance, there's always going to be a responsibility upon headquarters to be able to transfer those learnings across country programs. Finally, the stakeholders playing in this space are more and more diverse by the day. We're not just looking at traditional donors. We're looking at private sector partnerships. We're looking at a complex ecosystem of international and national NGOs as well as government players. And there's a real need for implementers to think about how they can coordinate, work on multi-stakeholder projects, and bring together learnings in a way that will make sense, resonate, and turn into better results in the end. From the donor community, there are also a lot of pushes towards improved coordination. I'm sure that we've all seen in the news or experienced in our work improved program mapping mechanisms. The UN has actually taken a lead on this and thought about different ways to go about mapping and coordinating where programs are happening and what results are happening. There's also an increased initiative to share failures through forums or through dialogues within and across organizations. And then there's also the Aid Transparency Initiative, which many of your organizations are likely signing into as well. How can we think about reporting in such a way that it tells a story beyond an individual organization? With that, I'll hand it over to Sophie to talk specifically about some of the barriers that we're seeing in agency-level measurement.
Thanks, Alison. So I think one of the things that comes up the most that we hear when organizations are talking about how they're going to do agency-level measurement is that it takes an incredible amount of financial and human resources in order to do this. It's also an incredibly long and intensive process that can involve a lot of change management and culture change within an organization to be prepared to bring together the kinds of results that will allow for effective agency-level measurement. But what we actually have seen a lot once we get into working with organizations is that there's quite a lot of internal structures going on that can also be really significant barriers to conducting agency-level measurement. So what we've done here is lay out 3 main categories of those barriers, and I'll talk briefly about each. So the first, around organizational structures. What we really see here is that there's a huge variety of M&E capacity, and I'm sure this is something that all of you are seeing across your organizations. And this might be across the organization, even within a country, within a program, the ability to conduct and understand effective M&E. This might mean, for example, that there are some programs that are carrying out comparison group studies, while others have barely taken a baseline or have not taken a baseline at all when they're looking at doing their M&E work. So that kind of capacity differentiation across an organization can be really difficult for them thinking about how can we do agency-level measurement. Secondly, when we're talking about M&E processes and systems, we really recognize that there is an incredible need to have valuable indicators and impactful M&E. But I think what most people hear when they think of that is really what are the gold standards in M&E, often randomized control trials, impact evaluations. So we hear over and over again how expensive those methodologies can be, and especially how long they can take. And so we see that there's a lot of opportunity to think about M&E processes and systems that are impactful but maybe don't require that kind of resources. And finally, results management. Here we're really talking about the ability to use results, and this is something I mentioned in terms of how mission measurement thinks about this, is really using results to drive management. And particularly here is around the concept of knowledge management. And a lack of effective knowledge management across an organization can be a particular hindrance to effectively implementing agency-level M&E. In a lot of cases, and you may have this in your organizations, there are platforms for knowledge management. You may host webinars around M&E, but oftentimes you get people to sign on. And in a very practical example, this might mean that you have a coffee program that you started successfully in one country. You want to go and start it in another country, but there's no resources available to look at lessons learned or key data findings from the other program. And oftentimes people are so resource constrained that reaching out to get that kind of knowledge can be incredibly difficult. And so we see that as another huge barrier of doing agency-level measurement. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time here just thinking about what are some of the ways to resolve these more organizational barriers to agency-level measurement. So if we look at the bottom of this slide, what we really see is the need in each of these 3 categories is first measurement sensitization. So the ability to actually identify and train your staff on practical, actionable indicators that link program goals to program activities. And we're really seeing here that oftentimes staff are not aware of kind of the link between M&E and what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis and how it drives decisions. So when that understanding doesn't exist at the foundation level, it drives all the way up to agency level measurement. Secondly, and this builds exactly on top of that, is measurement cohesion. Providing coherent measurement systems that allow for consistent collection of quality data is incredibly important once you're starting to think across different programs and how you build up to that agency level. And then finally, in terms of really getting buy-in from both external and internal stakeholders, there needs to be actionable measurement happening. Agency-level measurement needs to not just be happening for the headquarters level, but it needs to be about being able to improve the demonstration of your organization's results and using valuable indicators that can actually be used comparatively across an organization to understand how is M&E actually informing what we do and how we proactively manage our programs. So that gives an overview to some of what we're seeing, and Alison will touch more on some of the cultural aspects later in our presentation.
Thanks, Sophie. So next we want to talk about the power of strategic agency-level measurement. We want to take a step back and think about why are we doing this and what is the value it can provide to our organization. And here at Mission Measurement, we have a way of thinking about this where we sort the value into 3 broad categories. We have achieve our mission, improve programs, and attract resources. And I just want to take a few minutes to think about how each of these plays into your programs on a daily basis in an actionable way. So when we think about achieving our mission with regard to agency-level measurement, it's important to think about the types of investments that your organization is making and your ability at all levels within your organization to understand what that impact is and how you're achieving that impact against the goals that you've laid out. With regard to improving programs, we want to make sure that once you've seen your results, you can look across various programs or across different countries, across different components of a program, and think about how you can better align resources to improve your impact. And Sophie will talk a little bit about this later as well. Attract resources refers to thinking about fundraising and thinking about engaging with donors. And we want to think about this in a really critical way. We need to make sure that our organizations are able to build a case to attract more support. And as we mentioned, we know that funds are tight now, and there's a high bar that has been set for the level of evidence that's required. And it's important for us to be able to think about this evidence both within a program and across programs. So we actually want to break this down a little bit more clearly between agency-level measurement and program-level measurement. When we think about achieving our mission at a program level, we want to make sure that we're measuring against program goals, but also doing it in such a way that it's driving towards agency-level strategy. And here the critical component to highlight is that program-level measurement is not something that is separate from agency-level measurement. What we're trying to highlight is the way in which program-level measurement contributes to agency-level measurement. When it comes to improving programs, at a program level, if you've collected consistent indicators across various activities, you'll be able to strategically allocate resources across your program in order to make sure that you're allocating those resources in such a place that it really makes sense and it's driving towards the goals that you have for your program. At an agency level, you can do that at an even higher level of aggregation and be able to look across different programs, across different sectors, and think about what's making sense and what's not, and how you can use that to drive towards your goals and towards your mission. With regard to attracting resources, of course we know that this type of engagement is very different at a program or a country level versus an agency level. At a program level, the more clearly you're able to demonstrate your results, the more clearly you're able to engage with regional donors. But at an agency level, your ability to aggregate quantitative data across your organization can really drive toward the ability to access unrestricted funding and diversify your funding base. So we all know that it's easy to do fundraising by being able to tell stories about the types of impacts and that your organizations are having. But given that there's a new and diverse donor base out there, it's important to also be able to think about what are the numbers that you can attach broadly to your organization, and then think about how you can use those numbers to engage donors that you maybe haven't had access to before. So I'll hand it back to Sophie to get us started on some of the best practices we're seeing in implementation of this agency-level measurement.
Great. So what we do want to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes on is really thinking about how can you best implement and integrate agency-level measurement into what's already happening within your organization. So Alison already laid out these three categories that we here talk about at Mission Measurement, but we really wanted to think about how do we actually translate those three buckets into what you need to do to implement agency-level measurement, and how have we seen it done effectively. So in the first case, around achieving our mission, this really requires the organization to establish a common language. Very often we see that in organizations that can be quite decentralized, there's not a common language around M&E and how results are thought about. And that can be one of the biggest barriers, as I already spoke about, to agency-level measurement. Around improving programs, one of the things that we've seen is around building these platforms for comparison and knowledge sharing, there does need to be a lot more consistency and effective usage in how those platforms are leveraged. And finally, the ability to attract resources is really centered around how do you actually demonstrate and talk about those organization-level results. So we wanted here to lay out some of the findings we've seen from some of your peers in the field through our work and research on this area. So when we talk about establishing a common language, a couple things we've seen is program teams often choose from groups of indicators, and this means that when you're looking at an organization, for example, that has operations in agriculture, the wash sector, nutrition, those are incredibly disparate sectors, and it may be very difficult to come to outcomes level indicators across the board. But there is an ability to choose from groups of indicators that allow you to group together your programs to measure in aggregate what actually best fits those individual program needs. And this is one of the best ways to go about agency level measurement when you do have a very multi-sector organization. And then secondly, the actual central vision of M&E really becomes operational when you have consistent structures and M&E roles and job descriptions. And Alison will talk about this a little more later, but actually building M&E into the incentives and performance review process is really incredibly important to making this happen at an agency level. When we talked about platforms and for comparison and knowledge sharing, one thing we mentioned was knowledge sharing platforms, but another one we've seen a lot of organizations implement is really agency-wide dashboards. Now, these are often, in many cases, really financial to start with, and organizations are really looking at their financial results across the board, which is incredibly important. But we often don't see those integrated with performance measurement results at the same time at that agency level. And when the financial results and the performance results are integrated, there's much more opportunity to use that agency level measurement effectively to strategically allocate resources across the organization. Something else we've seen here around really building these platforms is that organizations are actually taking the time to pause in their daily operations and have mandatory meetings for staff to actually present findings from their data and lessons from their ongoing projects that allows it to really be a useful management tool as they continue throughout their programs and afterwards. And finally, around demonstrating organizational level results. We're really talking here about many times annual reports or whatever types of communiques you have as an organization to your stakeholders. But the more impactful and results-oriented these reports are, the more that can leverage the agency level results that you're collecting on. And then finally, one thing that we've also seen is organizations that actually have both a policy arm and a program arm find it incredibly effective to be able to leverage agency-level results in their policy work. It creates a more powerful story if you're able to tell it about a whole number of programs rather than constantly pointing to narratives or case studies about very specific programs. So one thing that I mentioned earlier that we wanted to discuss was really this concept of strategic alignment. And Alison and I have touched on this both today, where we are talking about how can you use the kind of both performance results and cost results to actually drive how you allocate resources. So here we've laid out what this might look like for an organization that has individual projects, then sectors, and finally the organization level. So at the bottom, we have the output level. And here you're really able, at the project level, for example, to determine the cost per output for each activity. At the sector level, you'd be able to determine the average cost per output across programs. And then finally, at the organizational level, actually determine the average cost per output for an entire sector. But then at the next level up, at the outcome level, you can start to look at what are costs per outcomes or average cost per outcomes at the sector level. And at the organizational level, the average cost per outcome across the sector. How you're being able to start to take those findings to the next level and that analysis and be able to start thinking, what kind of outcomes are we paying for, and how can we actually look at our higher performing programs and allocate resources in an effective way. But then the highest level of analysis that we're really pointing to here is at the impact level. And so we're actually here within a project level, you can get your project managers to actually think, what activities are driving the greatest impact most cost effectively in my project? At the sector level, starting to think which programs are actually driving greatest impact most cost effectively. But then at the agency level, and this is what we're starting to be able to see organizations able to do once they've effectively implemented agency level measurement, is they can actually determine for this organization which sectors drive the greatest impact most cost effectively. and really look at those results to think, how do we move forward in an effective way? And this will exactly respond to what Alison spoke about earlier, that donors are looking for in terms of being a learning organization, and implementers are also interested in being able to do effectively. So what this may actually look like in practice, and this is something we've worked with organizations to do, is to think through, once you've set thresholds for what performance and cost look like within your own organization, actually being able to assign programs or sectors into these buckets. And so we lay out low-performing, high cost, low-performing, low cost, high-performing, low cost, and high-performing, high cost. And what we think, though, aside from actually being able to start putting your programs into these kinds of buckets, which can be an interesting exercise in itself and very powerful, we think it's really more about the questions you ask once you're able to do this kind of alignment. So for example, on a program that comes out as low-performing, low-cost, we would ask, is it actually too early to expect high-performing results for the selected outcomes we're looking at? Have there been extenuating external circumstances that have prevented high performance? Are low performance or high cost the result of insufficient resources or poor design? And asking those kinds of questions will let you know, is this something we want to continue investing in because there's a reason it's low performing at the moment, or is this something that we really need to think about either eliminating or somehow realigning resources to make it more effective? We do put the high performing, high cost as kind of the green bucket here, though we recognize that not all highly effective programs might fall into that. But you might ask, if you have a number of programs in that green bucket, are these high-performing results expected to continue? Is there an opportunity to expand the beneficiaries who are receiving these successful interventions? Is there a way to realign resources within our organization to actually support a greater number of participants to be part of this? And so what we really want to highlight here also is that we recognize there may be just different geographies or implementing contexts for programs that might drive costs or performance to be a certain way, but it is really about being able to ask these questions across an agency and start to think about your agency as a whole rather than at this very program-specific level.
And so I'm sure you all are thinking now, great, I would love to be able to do this type of strategic alignment exercise within my organization, but how do I go about getting the data that will allow me to do this type of analysis? And I think that a big challenge that organizations face when trying to come up with agency-level measurement indicators is trying to figure out how to deal with this apples to oranges challenge. When organizations are working in different sectors, have different types of projects, how do we create that common language that will allow different programs to speak to each other? And I know that we have a very diverse base of participants on the call today, and so we want to highlight how this might play out differently in different types of organizations. If you're working within a single sector agency, congratulations, your job is a little bit easier. You'll be able to track outputs, as you will in a multi-sector agency, across beneficiaries, number of services provided, dollars distributed, these results that are really focused on just delivery of services. But when you want to measure indicators that are at the outcome and impact level, if you're a single sector agency, you need to make sure that you can push towards the types of indicators that will resonate across your different programs. Now, it's a little bit easier than a multi-sector agency, but you want to look at these types of metrics in a way that will be relevant to the programs that are implementing them as well. And so there's a need for headquarters level and agency level measurement, and there's also a need within the individual program to have indicators that make sense. Within a multi-sector agency, again, outputs is something that's fairly self-explanatory, but when you're trying to push to outcomes and impacts, the truth is that if you want to be able to tell a story that's really going to resonate, and when I say tell a story, we're talking not just about advocacy and fundraising. What we're talking about is the ability to talk internally within your organization about what your results are and what is going to be your trajectory for continuing those results and improving those results. So when we talk about aggregating outcomes within a multi-sector agency, what you have to do is really think about your different program areas or your different sectors, depending on the language your organization uses. Think about a bucket, defining a bucket or a basket of indicators that you could use for those types of programs and selecting the indicators that will make sense at the individual program level. Again, from a single sector agency perspective, you likely only have one bucket that you need to choose from, and you may be able to be a little bit more specific about the types of indicators that you require programs to collect. And what follows from that is, of course, the conversation about how do we go about doing this in a low-cost way. We all know that M&E budgets are restricted and that the capacity and the attention span and the interest level for carrying out this type of M&E can really vary across an organization. And what we want to highlight here is the fact that really this needs to be a smart process. And it begins at the program level. What you need to do is first be able to identify those outcomes that you care about at a program level, from the bottom up. Select those metrics which make sense. Think about how to align those with any donor requirements that you maybe have. And then choose from your bucket of indicators that will allow you to integrate those metrics which you're already collecting in with those that the headquarters is going to require in order to be able to do agency-level measurement. And what we want to highlight here is that there's a role for program best practices to play and a role for headquarters best practices to play. At the program level, you need to be thinking about M&E in a smart way, thinking about measuring what matters and not thinking about measurement as an accountability exercise. And from the headquarters perspective, we realize that agency-level measurement is often something that comes from the top down, but that there needs to be a flexibility and an integrated process laid out that allows programs to measure what still will make sense to headquarters while making sense to their individual programs as well. And the thing is that if you go about this process in an appropriate way, this will help you to really reduce costs when it comes to streamlined data collection. When you have your teams out in the field, if they can reduce the number of questions they need to ask, if they can reduce the number of data points they need to enter into a computer, it will really help increase buy-in for agency-level measurement and also make it a more useful tool for looking at how to align resources at the program and the agency level. And then when it comes to operationalizing agency-level measurement, it's important for us to take the time to think about the carrots and sticks approach to measurement. And I think that, in all the organizations that we work with, this topic of carrots and sticks inevitably comes up. And the answer is that in order to be able to effectively carry out agency-level measurement or any change in M&E policy, you really need to be able to both incentivize and enforce those policies that you are developing. And I think that, the important thing is that thinking about carrots and sticks is not something that's novel or new. However, it is something that we frequently don't take the time to pay attention to. And we forget that making an upfront investment in this type of incentivization and enforcement can really play out in better impacts and better data when it comes to M&E. And so we want to highlight that this starts out at the beginning of a program, when you're thinking about how to develop new programs and how to be innovative. You can create the carrot of being able to share data and create staff opportunities to contribute their own ideas to new projects. You have your field staff that are out in the field all day long, and they're coming up with ideas. And there needs to be a forum in an area, maybe a weekly meeting. We've seen that in some contexts, where there's a space for the entire team to be engaged in driving new programs and driving business development. On the stick side of things, we also need to make sure that there are standard policies. Oftentimes you have those who are writing proposals not being those who are implementing the programs. So you need to make sure that those who are involved in proposal development are required and have policies that make sure that they refer to existing data and existing results from projects that have already been implemented or undergoing implementation. At the level of implementing a program, this continues to play out. Again, we can't emphasize enough that it's important for program managers to be able to build their staff capacity and understanding of indicators. At a country level, it's really important for program officers or other M&E staff who are in the field to understand why the data they're collecting matters. And building in weekly training sessions or monthly training sessions, reminders about when and where data is important is something that can really pay off when it comes to data quality. And of course, on the enforcement side, people who are collecting and inputting data need to understand that their supervisors are looking at that data and that they're doing it in a timely fashion. it doesn't help when data is collected in March and then in June, you hear back from headquarters that there needs to be a change or a follow-up with other questions. It's really important for this to be done timely and for there to be a lot of transparency around the importance of it as well. When it comes to reporting, again, this sounds simple, but it's important for programs to be able to create visible and easy access to indicators across their projects. And this happens at a daily level. I feel like oftentimes in management, there's a lot of discussion about strategy and where programs are headed and how programs are doing, but that doesn't follow through to the rest of the organization. At the country level, put the numbers up on a chalkboard. Take it out of the computer if the computer is something that's not working. Make sure that people can see how they're doing and how they're progressing towards the goals that their programs are achieving. I think that oftentimes we think so much about compliance that we forget that there is an opportunity to build buy-in from your staff and have them understand what it is that all of their implementation and measurement activities are driving towards. And finally, on the enforcement side, championing compliance, again, is really important, and making sure that there are compulsory systems in place and data checking and feedback at the agency level as well as the program level. So when we take a step back and we look at this whole change management process that comes along with agency level measurement, we need to understand that this is not something that happens overnight. We're talking about organizational culture change, and it's something that needs to be done with a lot of intentionality. All of the organizations that we've worked with say that in reality, effectively implementing this type of measurement is something that's going to take several years. And it's important that while it comes from the top, that it involves input from other areas in the organization. So here we just want to highlight this process, that it's important to make sure that you collect input in the way that you drive your strategy, that you look for individuals in your organization that are willing to champion your effort and understand it and can share that message, and that you use those champions to help you formalize your structures. And that most importantly, as you're building broad support for this, that you make it an iterative process and you continue to collect input and continue to refine the processes that you're using for agency level measurement.
Thanks, Alison. So we wanted to wrap up there and make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and our answers that Laia will facilitate. And we'll also put up here, for those of you who don't have questions at the moment but may in the future, our contact information, and we look forward to the opportunity to hear from you. Thank you all for being on the call today.
Alison, Sophie, thanks very much. And sorry, I think I hear myself echoing a bit, but we do have 2 questions already, and I'll pose those verbally to you all. The first question is, what evidence is there that aggregate level measurement is increasing organizations' ability to attract resources? So that's the first question. And the second question is, in areas where there isn't a lot of causal evidence about what interventions work, how do you analyze the cost per outcome or impact?
Great. Thanks, Laia. Do you want to talk about the first one?
Sure. I think when we talk about attracting resources, to be perfectly honest, it's important to make sure that there's really a diversity of approaches used. When we think about the types of donors that are getting involved in the space, it's not just about pounding the pavement and looking for individual donations or looking for those high-value individual donors. It's also about engaging the private sector and helping the private sector, who is now more and more invested in driving social outcomes that can drive their core business strategy. And I think that this is a place where we've seen opportunities within our core business, outside of the international development space and within it, for a real engagement from the private sector and a real desire to understand in numbers what an organization does. Now, I can't give you a percentage rate of return on that investment, but what I can say is that that's something that's become a real critical component of core business strategy for several leading private sector organizations. And I think that this data can really provide value in that way.
I think there is some evidence, too, that the organizations that are able to do this and are more savvy in agency-level measurement are often also those that are more savvy in some of those private sector partnerships that Alison mentioned. So to think about the second question around if there is a lack of causal evidence, how do you actually think about some of those cost per outcome, cost per impact data? And I think the answer there is that what we really see in a lot of organizations is that there is causal evidence in that your program has already conducted it elsewhere in the world or region, for example. There may have been RCTs or other types of impact evaluations conducted by other organizations that actually form that evidence base. And what we mentioned in the presentation today is that oftentimes those resources are not being consulted at the beginning of a project to actually say, what is the base of evidence out here and what can we build from? That being said, if you really are trying something innovative that doesn't have any causal evidence, we do see the role there for more kind of advanced impact evaluations. These are the cases where you might be looking to a comparison group study or some type of other impact evaluation that really looks at, does the theory of change that we are testing actually work, and creating that proof of concept that your organization will then be able to use going forward, and hopefully also the wider industry.
And I think that what we want to highlight here is that the reason that we talk about this in terms of impact, outcomes, and outputs is that even if you're able to drive at the outcome level, there's a lot of real value that can be added there. If you have a proven theory of change, then outcomes level measurement can be a key criteria that drives your ability to do this type of strategic alignment. And I think that, causal evidence is something that I think that we all get a little bit frustrated by sometimes when we say, well, I don't have any money to do an impact evaluation. And I think that it's really important to think about what are the indicators that you can collect on a daily basis that are in some ways proxies for the type of impacts that you're trying to achieve. And that thinking very strategically about when and where causal evidence might make sense. Particularly if you're working in emergency programming, we know that you're never going to be doing randomized control trials. You're never going to be looking for attribution. But thinking about, again, those indicators that you can track on a daily basis is something that actually can be really telling in terms of thinking about adaptive management and the ways that you can improve the implementation of your program.
Great, thanks very much. We have a few more questions coming in. This question is from someone that's observing that they're aware of agencies that have attempted agency-wide aggregated measurement for the first time, and they're not sure that the exercise has been rewarding given the amount of time and resources that went into it, and that regional and national level staff don't tend to use the data generated. So how would you address this situation?
Yeah, and I think that actually gets back to what we were talking about at the end of the presentation, that this isn't something that you get right away. It's a challenge that is oftentimes iterative over several years. And I understand the pain that oftentimes you don't hear that data being used at a regional or at a program level. And I think that resonates back to the fact that the types of indicators they're using have to be the types of indicators that can also provide some sort of value. Of course, there's always going to be a component of this that is an accountability exercise, but at the program level, your ability to look at the data that you're already collecting and how that plays into an agency-level measurement is something that can really play out and have a positive impact.
Okay. Our next question goes back to the slide where you were talking about agencies that work in one sector or another sector. This person is asking whether you have any recommendations on how you can measure outcomes that are not sector-based but more holistic in nature. For example, strengthen community cohesion and connectedness that may be one of the intended outcomes of a water and sanitation project.
Yeah, and I think that actually that's a really important point to push upon. And I think that that's something that oftentimes has to be thought about at the level of the mission of a particular organization, and how we can think about the types of indicators that can drive towards mission, and those may be specific to the individual organization in which you're working. So I think that if there's a theory of, you have your theory of change outlined for your entire organization, you can create a broader bucket of indicators that might drive towards strengthened communities or something like this. I think that those are really important types of components to look at measuring. But the problem is that your ability to aggregate that and make it an apples-to-apples exercise can be a bit more difficult. But I think that it's absolutely worth working on and worth trying, because you're right. There will be indicators that aren't specific to a specific sector, but oftentimes the way that you measure that, you can have an outcome that you're trying to achieve across sectors, but the indicator that is attached to it has to be different by the sectors that you're operating in.
Before I pose the next question, I just want to note that we will be making the slides available after this, as well as the webinar recording, so you will have access to those after the presentation. This next question is, I think, one that many organizations are struggling with now. How important is, in your experience, is it that agencies have a centralized database or online data management system in accomplishing agency-wide measurement? And we get a lot of questions here at Interaction about M&E databases and what are good systems to use for that. So maybe you could speak to that as well.
Sure. I think that our answer to the first part of the question is it's incredibly important, and this is probably the biggest basis for a lot of what we spoke about today around having consistent M&E structures, cohesive measurement systems across an organization. Having that common centralized database is probably the foundation of that. In terms of the actual system, we've seen a lot of variation in organizations and found that it's probably less about the platform itself. We've seen anything from free kind of Google Docs type open source platforms to more complex customized ones that are from maybe a more corporate platform being used, but it's more about the ways that those are designed to actually fulfill the needs of the organization and that the data can be entered in a consistent way. And it is oftentimes that they do need to be customized to the level that each program has its own kind of portal, but then there's also the centralized portal that pulls data from each of those. And if that can be done by your platform, that's probably the best that we've seen.
And I think that what we would add to that is that it's absolutely important to have those systems in place and to make sure that you do all of the troubleshooting and really listen to all of the issues that you hear coming from the field about, connectivity and access, because those really can be real barriers to people actually using the system. But in addition, there has to be the demand and the supply side both play strong roles here. And so, people will be more willing to engage with the platform when they know that there's information there that will be valuable to them. So getting people to use the platforms and access the platforms is something that's going to be really critical. And I think that resonates back to what we were saying about both the enforcement and the incentives that you can build with these types of systems, and making sure that you have appropriate places in a program process where people are required to post data to that system, but that also, and then that then creates a place that has valuable data that can be accessed by others in the organization that are trying to implement or start programs. And that, we also want to highlight that it's not just about the indicators and the data. So much about this, an effective knowledge management system, is being able to think about it quantitatively and qualitatively. So continue all of those exercises, hosting webinars and having other types of presentations and learning techniques involved in whatever platform that you build out. And also make sure that you bring that down to the in-person level by having time set aside for meetings within your program teams and across your program teams to understand what's going on and where you can reach for more resources to improve your program.
Great, thanks very much. I'll pose two questions next. The first one is a clarification on a point you made earlier. Could you explain a bit more of what you meant by the fact that advocacy efforts need to create evidence to create policy pushback from donors? If you could clarify that point. And the second question is, this is an organization that can see how agency-level measurement might help them get more funding, but they're asking whether you think that agency-level measurement will increase the total donor resource pie, either by increasing the number of donors or the level of resources made available by existing donors. So I guess as more evidence of effectiveness comes into play, might that increase the amount of funding available for organizations' activities overall in the system?
Right, right. And I think that those two questions are really linked. So I'll start by tackling the first one, and I think that that'll in some ways flow into the second question as well. When it talks about advocacy effort, when we talk about advocacy efforts and using evidence to create policy pushback, what we're talking about is making sure that we break down the firewalls between different departments in our organization so that program staff are collecting data that can flow into policy pushback and decision making. And of course, when we talk about policy pushback, we're talking very broadly. The donor base is very broad, and your ability to create that pushback varies by the type of donor that you're engaging with. But I think that, even from an informal level of having a conversation with your donor about particular changes to their funding structure, which might make sense, up to really having advocacy campaigns and these types of things to change the way that development happens. Each of those can be, in some ways, accented or complemented by having this evidence that you have easy access to from the data that you've been able to collect and aggregate from the field up to headquarters level. And so then I think, the second part of that question is, how do we think that this can increase total resources? I mean, that's a very challenging question to answer, but I think that, what we want to think about is how can we think smartly about the types of resources that do exist and getting them allocated in the ways that make sense. Of course, it's going to be a lot more difficult if you're dealing with something like the U.S. Congress versus a foundation. But I think that the individual leading organizations can create a voice to help change the way that different programs are funded. And the more organizations that are doing that, I think that could have an impact as well. Of course, increasing resources is something that can be a little bit difficult as a goal in this current time, but it's always something to strive for.
I think also just our work with funders has really demonstrated how important it's becoming to them that their grantees really are learning organizations and that they are taking the findings they have on a regular basis and actually improving the way that they operate. So the more that can be demonstrated and the more it can be demonstrated as an organization and not just at that very program-specific level, we think that could drive towards more interest from those kinds of funders and what they're really valuing as kind of in this space at the moment.
Great. So Alison, Sophie, thanks again. We are at the end of our time. Before we close, I just wanted to give you a chance to say any last thoughts you want to leave our participants with. Any last words you want to say?
Yeah, I think we just want to thank you all for tuning in and engaging in this discussion. Again, our impetus for having this webinar was that we hear so much of similar types of feedback and similar types of pain points among organizations. So I think that we would encourage you all to reach out to us if you have any questions or follow-up. We're happy to chat, and we think that this is a really important discussion for organizations across the international development sector to be engaged in.
And I think probably what we've highlighted today is that this is a very practical and cultural issue more than it is kind of the traditional pushback we hear, which is that it's expensive and it requires a lot of resources, that there are a lot of other aspects of this conversation that we wanted to bring up and really think about as organizations, more and more organizations move towards doing this. So thank you all, and we look forward to hopefully being in touch with some of you.
Great. Thanks very much. And thank you all for joining us. Like I said, the presentation and the webinar recording will be available, and you'll get an email letting you know where you can find those. So thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we can continue the discussion even further. Thanks very much.
Thanks.